guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound, and today we are looking at how to get the drum sound of Burning Down the House by Talking Heads.
The drummer was Chris Franz. It was self-produced. It is a pretty simple part, but we're gonna use it as a way to explore some phase relationship stuff and some compression stuff. Let's figure it out.
For our drums, we used a Ludwig Vista-Lite kick drum, a Ludwig Acrolite snare, and Zildjian K-Suite 14-inch hats.
For the toms, we knew that we needed every single tom imaginable. We knew that we needed Rototoms. Literally, I was emailing about trying to find Rototoms, and we were cleaning out the studio that day, and one of our interns found a set of Rototoms in our attic. So if you're looking for Rototoms, just go up to your attic. You'll find Rototoms there. Ours were covered in dust. When we were tuning them, there was literally dust falling out of the bottom. But we paired that with our Gretsch kit and they worked together really well.
So this beat might sound like a simple dance beat, but to play it, you have to have the eighth notes going on the kick and the hi-hat, so it could be a little tricky, especially because you want to keep those lower than how hard you're hitting the snare. So I had to separate the hi-hat a little bit further from the kit and try to play as lightly as I could on that while being able to keep the kicks consistent and those snare hits consistent.
So for Burning Down the House, at its basic core, it's pretty simple, right? It is two drum parts put on top of each other. You have a drum kit that is really simple, kick, snare, hi-hat. That drum kit was recorded with 3 mics. The overhead was mono. Everything was really close. Everything was really gated, and everything was run through a bunch of reverb. You also have a separate drum kit that is all toms, and that was recorded separately as an overdub. So starting with the main kit, the miking was very simple. It was a kick drum mic that was a RE20, quintessential 80s kick drum mic, not a ton of low end, which is kind of what we want for this. We don't want this super, super modern low end, and a really pronounced, like punchy attack, right? And that's really most of what we needed because there was a significant part of this kick drum sound, which was nonlinear reverb. Moving on to the snare. Snare, again, super, super simple. 1 mic, SM57. We had to be kind of specific about the placement. As you stick an SM57 on a snare drum, how close you are to the snare drum physically, it's gonna pronounce the proximity effect more, which is gonna add these low mids to the sound. So based on how much of that low mids, that's gonna kind of dictate the distance. As far as the angle, when you are parallel to the drum, as in when you're pointing across it, you're gonna get a ton of attack, right? A really, really sharp, pronounced attack. You're not gonna get quite as much low end and as much tone. As you angle it further and further up, you're gonna get less and less attack, more tone. You're also gonna get a little bit more of the bottom snares because you're kind of facing the bottom of the drum a little bit more. And so we had to kind of play around a little bit with that angle. We ended up going with something that was mostly pointed across the snare because we wanted a ton of attack on this. We knew that there was a bunch of length that was going to come from the reverbs, so we didn't necessarily need to get a ton of the length out of the snare itself. When I said overhead earlier, what I really mean is a hi-hat mic. This is just a slightly higher up, a close miking of a hi-hat. We position the hi-hat a little further away from the snare drum so that we could get mostly just hi-hat in this mic. We used a small diaphragm condenser mic, KM84. The reason that we're using that particular mic is it has a really well-balanced high end and it has a ton of detail, and that's really what we were looking for. We're not looking for this to be a big chunky hi-hat. We're not looking for it to take up any more space in the mix than it needed to. We just need it to fill up a very specific frequency range, and using a small diaphragm condenser, it's gonna help kind of get us a little bit further to that point without quite as much EQ. So now for the processing. The processing was pretty simple, but it's really, really crucial, right? The only processing that we used was a little bit of EQ. That was just to kind of further shape the tones, right? Add a little bit more high end, take out a little bit of high end on the hi-hats, things like that. And then the critical part was the compression. Now this is a perfect instance of how to use compression to shape the sound of a snare drum. When you're using a compressor, the controls are pretty simple: ratio, threshold, attack, release. There's a million videos out there that'll show you exactly what those are doing. In this particular instance, we wanted very specific things out of this compression. We did not necessarily want the snare drum to come super, super forward or get super, super hyped up. What we really wanted to do was control the way that the transient sounded on the snare drum and control the way that the decay of the snare drum sounded. The attack control, when you are compressing a snare drum, the full snare drum sound is going to come through, and as soon as it crosses the threshold, the attack timer goes off, right? And once that attack time gets reached, then it is going to pull down on that compression, right? It's going to pull down the volume. So you get only a little bit of a sliver of the full volume snare drum before you get the compressed snare drum. Now, changing that attack time, it's going to change the amount of length that just the transient of that snare has, right? So you can take, some would call it like the snap of the snare. You can take that snap and you can decide, is this gonna be like a fatter snap? Is this gonna be a really, really tiny little snap? Controlling that is in itself really useful, but when you are feeding that into heavy, heavy reverb, it becomes a whole other thing, right? Because if you mess around with that control while you're feeding the snare drum into a big reverb, you're gonna hear that reverb completely change based on what the attack is. If you give it a little bit fatter of an attack, all of a sudden, it's lighting up that reverb in a different way, right? It might be bringing out frequencies that are coming into that reverb that weren't coming in when you had a really, really sharp attack. So just load up a compressor, compress like 4 or 5 dB, and then just move that attack time around and see what happens to the sharpness of your snare drum. Once we got our attack dialed in, we needed to look at the release of that snare drum compressor. Now, the release time, right? Once you come above the threshold, the release is gonna let go of the compression. And if you let go of the compression really quickly, what's gonna happen is as soon as your snare drum hits, it's gonna compress quickly, it's gonna release, and it's gonna bring up all of the sound of the length of the snares, right? It's gonna bring up all of the decay of that snare, right? It's gonna bring up any ring that's going on in the snare, it's gonna bring up any snare sound that's going on in the snare. So if you start to lengthen that release time, all of a sudden, the decay of the snare is gonna start to get lower and lower and lower. You're gonna feel it kind of surge back in, but the immediate decay of that snare, it's gonna be immensely effective. In this case, that was really important because we wanted the decay of the snare to be all reverb. We were not looking for the snares to be really giving a lot of the length to the snare. We were looking for just the reverb to be the length. So the snare drum that you've been hearing so far, that has an 1176 baked into it. We processed it through it on the way into Pro Tools. That 1176 is at 4:1 ratio. It has a fairly long attack time. It has a medium release time, and we're doing maybe 4 decibels of compression. The reverb is kind of the other half of this equation, right? The reverb is just as important as the sound of the actual drums. This is a super, super classic 80s quote-unquote gated reverb sound. What it actually is, it's an AMS RMX16, and it is the non-linear setting. It sounds like gated reverb. Technically, it's not. It's like an algorithmic digital reverb thing where it has a big burst of reverb and then it completely shuts off really abruptly, so it feels like it's gated. So we had that AMS set to the non-linear setting. It is just the stock settings. When you pull it up, UAD makes a great plugin of it, and if you just pull up the non-linear settings, these are the default ones that come up. That's what we're using today. It kind of naturally sounds like it has a little bit of a pre-delay just in the bloom of the reverb, but we had the pre-delay technically set to 0. And we were then giving a little bit of EQ after this reverb. This reverb is like almost like white noise. It creates so much harmonic information, and because of that, you can carve it like it's any other part of the drum. You can completely change the tonality of this reverb, and it tends to sound really, really, I won't say natural, but it sounds like itself regardless of how much EQ you put on it. Now we get to what was, at least for Jessica, the most fun part of the day, which was just like wailing on as many toms as we could fit in front of her with huge gated reverb on it. All the processing is pretty similar, right? We used a pair of Sheps overheads, spaced pair, simple with not a lot of processing on them. For all the toms, we did an interesting thing which was really popular in the 80s, which was we stuck Sennheiser 421 mics inside of the drums. We took all the bottoms off and we stuck them inside of the drums. This is something that was often done because of isolation, because of how deeply they wanted these drums gated and they didn't want any cymbal bleed in them. And if you stick a microphone inside of the drum, you have a physical barrier that will help where it's mostly just tom sound. But it also kind of has become the sound of the 80s toms. And so when you take that specific sound, which sounds a little bit strange on its own, and you run it through a nonlinear gated reverb, all of a sudden it sounds exactly like every 80s tom fill that you've ever heard, ever wanted to hear. The one thing that we had to keep track of on this was the phase relationships between the tom mics and the overheads. This is the case whenever you are dealing with multiple microphones recording one instrument, right? Even though it's multiple toms, we're considering it one instrument. We have overhead mics and we have direct tom mics. Now, the phase relationship between those microphones is gonna be a little bit random. It's based on the distance, it's based on what the toms are tuned to, and because of a bunch of these different variables, when you add those two microphones together, they may be adding to each other, as in they may be trying to push air out of the speaker at the same time in the same direction, or they may be trying to subtract from each other. You may be pushing air with the overheads in one direction and trying to push air in the other direction with the direct mics. The result is way thinner toms than you want. There's really simple ways that you can check this. Every preamp that you're ever gonna use has a phase switch on it. Pretty much any channel strip plugin that you're gonna use has a phase strip on it. There's a million ways to switch the phase. Bring in each mic one at a time, check the phase relationship between them when compared to the overheads, flip that phase switch. If the sound comes forward and gets more body, it means that it's getting more in phase. If the sound goes back, it means it's getting more out of phase. Oftentimes it's going to be really clear. If ever it's not, you might need to move the microphones a little bit because it means that you're getting partial cancellation, and that's the worst of both worlds. that's how we did Burning Down the House by Talking Heads.
Thanks for watching, and as always, let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to hear us break down. We will see you next time.